Welcome to the Quiet Becoming. Tonight we enter the quiet space where something doesn't feel quite right, but you've convinced yourself it's love. You stay up, tracing the echoes of a voice that said you're too much or not enough, and still, you want to please it. You bend, you fold, you apologize for having needs, and still something in you aches, quietly, persistently, whispering that something is off. You probably won't survive this version of yourself, and maybe that's a good thing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see who else is unraveling with you tonight. Allow the noise to fade, the stillness to bloom, and together we'll begin. It always starts small, a sigh when you speak, a pause when you express a need, a subtle turning away, and then come the words that dress themselves as love. Why are you being so sensitive? I just want you to be happy. I only worry because I care. But beneath the words is a current, and you feel it pulling you under. What they say sounds like care, but what you feel is confusion, dissonance, guilt. And guilt, when repeated often enough, starts to replace your truth. You begin to flinch before asking for what you need. You begin to apologize for your own emotions. You start doubting the clarity of your inner compass. And slowly, you learn to compromise not just your preferences, but your identity. You shrink. You silence yourself. You rationalize what hurts you. Because somewhere along the way, someone taught you that love is pain in prettier clothes. Carl Jung taught that what we fail to make conscious will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. Emotional manipulation is one of those unconscious scripts. It doesn't always scream. Often, it whispers. It tucks itself inside compliments. It says you're everything they need, and then punishes you when you try to become something more. It disguises possessiveness as protection. It makes you question whether your needs are reasonable at all. You learn to confuse discomfort with intimacy. You begin to associate the flutter in your stomach not with danger, but with connection. And your nervous system, once clear, becomes tangled in the stories they spin. You start rewriting yourself just to keep the peace. You tell yourself it's worth it, that all relationships require sacrifice, and they do. But not this kind. Not the kind that demands you abandon your truth to maintain someone else's comfort. Manipulation isn't always conscious. Some people repeat what was done to them. They control because they fear chaos. They guilt trip because that's how they were raised. But that doesn't make it your responsibility to carry the weight of their healing. Your job is not to decode their pain at the cost of your own. Your job is to notice the moment you begin to vanish. When love feels like tension, like walking on glass, like constantly trying to earn your place, you are not being held, you are being managed, and it is management, not connection. If someone only shows you affection when you're agreeable, when you're easy, when you're silent, then it's not love they're giving, it's compliance they're rewarding. Jung spoke of the soul's truth. He said when it's denied, it falls ill. The illness begins subtly. You sleep a little less, you sigh a little more, you begin to distrust your joy. You stop reaching for what lights you up. You tell yourself it's temporary, that things will settle, that the version of you who once felt free will return when things calm down. But things don't calm down, because the pattern repeats. They create storms, then offer shelter from them. They push you to the edge, then call you back with just enough tenderness to keep you hoping. And you learn to live in that space, in between love and anxiety, care and confusion. The cost is slow, silent, invisible. You stop recognizing the you that once moved through the world with clarity. You forget the sound of your unfiltered voice. You begin to second-guess even your joy, because you're unsure whether you're allowed to hold it. This is what emotional manipulation does. It takes your instincts and reprograms them. It turns your no into a maybe, and your yes into guilt. It rewrites your sense of what's normal. And worst of all, it makes you think you chose it, but you didn't choose this. You adapted to it. You learned to survive inside it. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. Awareness is the first act of resistance. You are allowed to say, this hurts, even if they say they love you. You are allowed to say, I need space, even if they say it means you're pushing them away. You are allowed to listen to your body, your intuition, your truth, especially when someone is trying to convince you not to. Because your soul wasn't designed to be edited. It wasn't meant to shrink to fit someone else's shadow. You are not here to be manageable. You are here to be whole. So if something inside you is whispering that this isn't right, listen. That whisper is not weakness. It's the voice of your original self, trying to come home. Sometimes it sounds so reasonable. I'm just being honest. I'm telling you how I feel. I'm only saying what no one else has the courage to say. But beneath those words, there's a sting, a tightness in your chest, a sharpness you weren't prepared for. Because what they call honesty doesn't feel like truth. It feels like being cut. And the wound it leaves isn't clean. It lingers, quietly, deeply, making you question your worth in the name of someone else's version of sincerity. Carl Jung knew the damage this kind of false honesty could do. He warned that the psyche doesn't grow by being broken down. It grows by being affirmed, built up, encouraged into its full expression. Contempt, no matter how artfully disguised, is still contempt, even when it wears the mask of truth. This is the wound beneath honesty, the way someone can use truth not as a tool for clarity, but as a weapon for control. It shows up in the little things, the subtle digs, the too casual comments about your choices, your appearance, your emotions. They say they're just being real. But what they're doing is reinforcing a power dynamic, one where they are the authority, and you are the one being corrected. Over time, this corrodes you, not all at once, not loudly, but piece by piece. You begin to flinch at their tone. You prepare defenses in your head before conversations even begin. You wonder if you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too complicated. Because they've taught you that their sharpness is your fault. That if you were stronger, you wouldn't feel wounded. That if you could just take a joke or handle the truth, you wouldn't be in pain. But pain is the body's way of telling the truth. And if your truth feels bruised after being around someone, you're not overreacting. You're responding to something real. The psyche internalizes contempt. It starts to see itself the way it is seen. It adopts the tone of its critics. You might find yourself saying the same things to yourself that they say to you. You mock your own dreams before anyone else can. You shut down your own joy to stay ahead of their judgment. And that's not growth. That's survival. You are not here to survive someone's cruelty masquerading as feedback. You are here to grow toward your wholeness. And wholeness doesn't come through erosion. It comes through compassion, through curiosity, through connection. True honesty isn't sharp. It's clear. It doesn't tear down. It reveals. It doesn't dominate. It invites. It comes from love, not from the desire to win or control or diminish. You can feel the difference. You know it in your body. Real honesty, even when it's hard to hear, feels respectful. It feels mutual. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't shame. It opens a path. It offers a hand. But when someone uses truth as a weapon, the goal is not understanding, it's superiority. It's keeping you small, uncertain, hesitant to rise. And Jung would say this is the shadow at play, the part of the person that cannot tolerate its own vulnerability, so it projects power instead. It controls. It criticizes. It cloaks its fear in the language of insight. You may love this person, you may want to believe that they mean well, and maybe in some distorted way they do. But good intentions don't heal bad patterns. If you walk away from conversations feeling less like yourself, if your spirit feels smaller after every interaction, if the sound of their voice makes you brace, you are not growing, you are enduring. And endurance is not intimacy. You were not meant to be a battleground for someone else's insecurity. You were not made to be a punching bag wrapped in politeness. Your mind, your heart, your dreams, they deserve environments that nourish, not environments that wound under the pretense of truth. So notice the tone. Notice how you feel after they speak. Notice how often their honesty leaves you spiraling, doubting, apologizing. And then ask yourself, when did I start calling this love? Because that's the deepest danger of contempt. It becomes familiar. It becomes background noise. You stop noticing the cuts because you've learned to bleed quietly. You stop asking for kindness because you've forgotten what it feels like. But you can remember. You can return to the places inside you that still believe in gentle truth, in voices that uplift, in conversations that challenge without crushing. Jung said the personality needs affirmation, not in a shallow way, not in a flattering way, but in a deeply human way. The psyche blossoms when it is seen clearly, yes, but also when it is seen kindly. If someone consistently sees you only through criticism, they are not seeing you. They are projecting. They are protecting themselves by keeping you small. You don't have to stay small. You don't have to make excuses for cruelty. You don't have to translate contempt into care. You are allowed to want words that nourish, that support, that invite you to grow without asking you to disappear. This is not too much to ask. This is your baseline. This is what your soul already knows it needs. And maybe tonight, you're ready to listen. It's easy to mistake protection for love, especially when the person standing beside you says they're only trying to keep you safe, especially when they speak in soft tones while quietly building walls around you, especially when their concern feels just close enough to care, but carries the weight of a cage. You hear them say things like, "I just want what's best for you," or "You don't need to do that, let me take care of it," and part of you exhales. You let them take over, make the decisions, set the limits. At first it feels like being held, but soon you start to notice the edges of your world shrinking, your voice growing quieter, your dreams paused on the shelf, and you begin to wonder when you stopped feeling free. Jung spoke often about the shadow's subtle hunger for control, not always through violence or aggression, but through limitation, the kind that masks itself as care, the kind that says, "Stay close to me because I'm worried, stay quiet because I know better, stay still because the world is too dangerous for you to move freely." And so you stay, not out of helplessness, but out of loyalty, out of trust, out of a learned belief that love is supposed to feel like management. That being seen means being supervised. That devotion requires restriction, but real love doesn't confine, it expands. Real love says, "Go become who you are, even if it takes you far from me." Real love holds space, not leashes. It invites growth even when that growth challenges the comfort of the relationship. Control, even when it's wrapped in affection, is still control. And when it replaces your autonomy, your soul feels it, quietly, persistently, in the things you stop saying, the opportunities you stop chasing, the small negotiations you make with yourself. Maybe I don't need that. Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe this is what love is supposed to look like. But it's not. Love doesn't ask you to erase yourself for someone else's security. It doesn't silence your voice for the sake of harmony. It doesn't reward your compliance and call it peace. It gives, it listens, it trusts. And when that trust is absent, when someone needs you to stay small in order to feel big, when they need you to be predictable in order to feel safe, what you're living inside isn't love. It's a projection, a strategy, an emotional transaction where your freedom is the currency. You'll hear it in their words. You'll feel it in your gut. That strange tension between being adored and being caged. You'll notice how they light up when you align with their expectations and grow distant when you express something unpredictable. You'll feel the pressure to stay within a version of yourself that keeps the peace, and you'll wonder when you started performing. Carl Jung said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Sometimes that means trying to manage someone else's. If they can keep you close, keep you dependent, keep you manageable, they don't have to confront their own fear of change, their own wounds, their own chaos, so they call their fear love, and you begin to internalize it. You start to think that needing space is selfish, that wanting solitude means you're withdrawing, that asserting boundaries means you don't care, and so you fold, you become easy, predictable, safe. But inside something withers. Your soul cannot thrive in a place where it's always being managed. It cannot breathe in a space where its aliveness is interpreted as danger. And no matter how soft the voice, no matter how gentle the touch, control is control. And you'll feel it when you stop laughing as much, when you look to them before making small decisions, when you feel guilt for exploring something without them, when you hold back your ideas, your spontaneity, your wildness, not because they forbade it, but because you've learned what they prefer. This isn't partnership, it's permission. And your soul was not born to ask for permission to be whole. Jung taught that the journey toward individuation, the process of becoming your full self, requires freedom. It requires confrontation. It requires leaving the known, even when the known feels like love. So if someone is wrapping you in care that feels like confinement, Ask yourself, what do they gain by keeping me small? And what have I lost by letting them? Because the cost is not just your freedom, it's your self-trust. It's the ability to listen to your own instincts without checking their reaction first. It's the quiet belief that you are capable of walking your own path without needing constant correction. You were not meant to be protected into passivity. You were meant to be supported into expansion. So take a breath. Look closely. Not at their words, but at their patterns. Not at how they say they love you, but at what they do when you move in ways they didn't plan for. And if love starts to feel like a leash, it's not love. If you have to shrink to stay safe, it's not safety. If your freedom becomes a threat, then you're not being protected, you're being claimed. Let that truth rise. Let it sting if it must, because behind the sting is your awakening. And you are not here to be controlled. You are here to become. There's a kind of disorientation that seeps in slowly. It doesn't arrive with a storm. It shows up like fog, gentle, subtle, but thick enough that you start forgetting what direction feels like. It begins when someone questions your memory, dismisses your feelings, tells you that what just happened didn't, that what you felt wasn't real, that your version of events is wrong, not because they know better, but because they need control more than they need connection. This is gaslighting, and Jung would call it an assault on the soul's compass. You feel it when the ground shifts beneath you, when you begin to doubt not just what's happening around you, but who you are inside it. You start asking yourself questions that feel impossible to answer. Did I misremember that? Am I too sensitive? Am I making things up? You replay conversations in your mind over and over, hoping to find clarity. But all you find is exhaustion, because that's what gaslighting does. It exhausts your truth. And once that truth is weakened, control can slip in. Not through force, but through confusion. Carl Jung once wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But gaslighting hijacks that process. Instead of leading you inward, it traps you in their version of reality. Their narration replaces your intuition. Their voice becomes louder than your own. And that, over time, dismantles your inner foundation. You begin to second-guess your emotional responses. You hold back your instincts. You apologize for things you didn't do. You slowly train yourself to seek their validation before trusting your own perception. Because what they've taught you, subtly, constantly, is that you cannot trust yourself. It might not even sound malicious. It often doesn't. It might sound like, "Are you sure that's how it happened?" "I don't think that's what I said. You always twist my words. You're making a big deal out of nothing." And on the surface, these sound like conversations, but they're not. They're psychological edits. And you are the manuscript being rewritten. Gaslighting becomes a cycle. You express, they deny, you doubt, they comfort, only to deny again later. The pattern loops until you're so tangled in contradictions that the only safe choice feels like silence. But silence is not safety, it's surrender. And your soul wasn't made to surrender to someone else's version of truth. Jung believed the unconscious always seeks balance. If your conscious mind is being overridden, your unconscious begins to rebel. It speaks through anxiety, through dreams, through illness, through that gnawing feeling that something isn't right, even if you can't explain why. That feeling is not paranoia. It's awareness trying to find a way back to the surface. You might notice how you start collecting evidence, writing down conversations, recording memories. Not because you're obsessive, but because you're trying to prove to yourself that you still remember how to trust your own reality. That your truth isn't broken. That your voice still matters, and it does. Even when someone tries to erase it. Even when they call you dramatic, oversensitive, unstable. Even when they rewrite the script so often you forget what the original story was. Gaslighting isn't always violent. Sometimes it's quiet, polite, wrapped in affection, and that makes it even harder to recognize, because the person who claims to love you is also the one disassembling your sense of self. They don't need you to agree with them. They need you to depend on them for clarity. They need you to need them, to interpret your own experience. And when that happens, you lose more than confidence. You lose orientation. You stop knowing where you stand, what you want, how you feel, and most dangerously, what you deserve. Jung would say that this is the moment when fate takes over. when what you haven't made conscious begins to rule you. The longer you live in someone else's version of truth, the harder it becomes to wake up from it. But the awakening is possible, and it begins here, with noticing the fog, with asking, what parts of myself have I stopped trusting? What emotions do I now treat as threats? What instincts do I silence before they even form? These are the questions that guide you back, because your inner compass never broke. It was just buried, beneath their denials, beneath their contradictions, beneath the quiet panic that made you believe love meant disorientation. But love, real love, is clarifying. It doesn't make you doubt your memory. It doesn't make you question your voice. It doesn't feel like losing your sense of direction. It feels like returning to it. You don't need to defend your perception to someone who truly values you. You don't need to archive every emotion just to prove you're not unstable. You don't need to shrink your truth so someone else can feel more comfortable in their version of events. You are allowed to remember, to name, to say this happened, even if they deny it, even if they leave, even if your voice shakes when you speak. Because the moment you start speaking again, the moment you say, I trust what I felt, you begin the slow, holy work of repairing the compass they tried to dismantle. And your truth, long buried, begins to rise, not for validation, but for liberation. You try to share a dream, something small, maybe even fragile, a little flicker of hope you've been carrying in secret, a project, a purpose, a piece of your creativity. You speak it softly, unsure of how it will land, and then, laughter, a joke, a flat comment that slices through the moment like it never mattered. You smile, you play along, you say, oh, it's not a big deal, but something in you goes quiet. You tuck that part of yourself away, maybe for good. Carl Jung emphasized the importance of integrating the authentic self, the deep inner essence that includes your creativity, your purpose, your fire. When someone dismisses that inner world, it doesn't just hurt, it fractures something vital. It tells your psyche that your dreams are too much, that your joy is unimportant, that what lights you up is a distraction, a hobby, a phase, a joke. This dismissal doesn't always come with yelling or criticism. Sometimes it's just an eye roll, a sarcastic shrug, a passive silence that says more than words ever could. And when that happens often enough, you begin to stop trying. You filter your ideas, you minimize your desires, you laugh off your passions before anyone else can, and your soul, slowly, quietly, starts to starve. The erosion of self doesn't always come through trauma. Sometimes it comes through dismissal, through the slow drip of invalidation that makes you question the value of your inner life. And that's where the damage lies. Not in one big event, but in the cumulative effect of being told over and over that what matters to you isn't real. Jung would say that when the inner world is rejected, the psyche becomes split. You start living a double life, one for them and one in secret. You hide your excitement. You keep your visions to yourself. You become a smaller version of the person you were meant to be, not because you don't believe in your potential, but because you've learned that no one else does. And that silence becomes internalized. You begin to censor your joy. You begin to ask permission before sharing what lights you up. You begin to feel guilty for having dreams that don't fit inside someone else's comfort. This is not love. This is not partnership. This is spiritual suffocation, because your soul at its core is creative. It doesn't have to be artistic, but it needs to express, to imagine, to build, to explore. And if someone can't make space for that, if they need your fire to stay dim in order to feel safe, then they're not loving you, they're managing you. And love isn't management. Love listens. Love leans in. Love says, even if I don't understand this dream, I honor that it's real for you. You don't need applause. You don't need someone to share your exact vision. You just need someone who doesn't mock it, someone who doesn't shrink you for daring to want more. Because when you live in a space where your inner world is devalued, you begin to doubt not just your ideas, but your worth. You forget that your voice is valid, even if no one else echoes it. You start to think that silence is safer than expression. And little by little, your fire becomes ash. But it doesn't have to stay that way, because you can reclaim it. You can name the dismissal for what it is. Not honesty, not feedback, but avoidance. Discomfort, insecurity. Some people mock what they can't create. Some people belittle what they fear they'll never understand. and it's easier to diminish your dream than to face their own lack of one. That's not your burden to carry. Your only task is to protect your light, to refuse to let someone else's smallness shrink your bigness, to remember that what you imagine matters, not because it's useful, not because it's impressive, but because it's yours. Jung believed that when the authentic self is rejected, symptoms emerge: depression, apathy, anxiety. These aren't random, they're signals. They're the soul trying to get your attention, saying, "You've abandoned something sacred. Please, come back," and you can. By honoring your own joy, even if no one else claps. By holding space for your inner world, even if no one else understands. By refusing to silence yourself, even when it feels easier. You don't have to perform your passions, you just have to respect them. So if you've been belittled for caring too much, dreaming too big, or feeling too deeply, know this: you are not the problem. Your passion is not the problem. Your joy is not a threat. What's dangerous is a world that teaches you to dim your fire in exchange for conditional affection. Don't make that trade. Not now, not ever. The people who truly see you will never need you to be less. They will recognize your spark and say, "Yes, that's the part I want to know more about. That's the part that feels like home. That's the part that should never be silenced." It starts when you're hurting and no one notices. Or they notice, but they look away. Maybe they change the subject. Maybe they say, "You're overthinking it." Or, "Everyone feels that way sometimes." You might get a pat on the back, a well-meant cliche, but not presence, not attunement, not empathy. And after enough of those moments, something inside you shifts. You stop reaching out. You stop naming your pain. You learn to wrap your suffering in silence. Because every time you try to let someone in, they close the door without realizing it. Carl Jung believed that empathy is the bridge between souls. Without it, no relationship can become fully conscious. No bond can become truly intimate. Because empathy is what allows us to step outside of our own perspective, to feel the world as another feels it, to say, "I may not understand everything, but I'm here with you inside it." When empathy is missing, the bridge collapses, and you're left on an island, calling out into a void. When someone consistently overlooks your hurt, invalidates your sadness, or sees your needs as burdens, you begin to doubt those needs. You begin to believe that needing care is weakness, that sharing yourself is too much, that maybe you should just be quieter, easier, more self-sufficient. But that's not growth. That's abandonment. That's not maturity. That's internalized dismissal. And it carves you into someone you don't recognize. Because when you live without empathy long enough, you stop believing in your own emotional landscape. You stop trusting your tears. You disconnect from the signals your body sends. You might still cry, but you apologize for it. You might still ask for help, but you feel guilty the entire time. This is not love. It's loneliness in disguise. And it's the kind of loneliness that doesn't go away in someone else's arms. Because even when they're near, you feel far. Because what's missing isn't presence, it's resonance. You don't need someone who's just physically close. You need someone who hears you without you having to raise your voice. Empathy isn't just a trait, it's a choice, a posture, a practice. It's when someone says, "I don't need to fix this, I just want to feel it with you." But when that choice isn't made, when your experiences are met with silence or skepticism, you begin to make a different kind of choice. You choose to suppress, to simplify, to shrink. You start to believe that you are difficult, that your emotions are heavy, that your sadness is a burden someone else has to carry. And that belief becomes a lens. You look at yourself through the eyes of the person who never saw you clearly. Jung would say that this is how the shadow forms, not just from the parts of ourselves we reject, but from the parts others rejected for us. Empathy is what brings those parts back. It's what says, "You're allowed to feel this. You're allowed to take up space in this moment. You're allowed to exist fully, even in pain." But without that reflection, those parts go underground, and you carry them alone, until you forget that carrying them alone was never supposed to be normal. You were never meant to do this by yourself. You were never meant to cry into silence. You were never meant to explain over and over why something hurt, only to be told you're being dramatic. And yet here you are, still reaching, still hoping, still believing that one day someone might meet you with softness instead of strategy, with presence instead of platitudes, with truth instead of transactional affection. And that hope, that's your inner self refusing to give up. That's your soul remembering what it deserves. Because empathy is not luxury, it's necessity. It's how relationships breathe. Without it, every connection becomes a performance. Without it, you become an actor in someone else's emotional script. Allowed to show joy, allowed to play supportive roles, but punished for bringing your full humanity to the stage. And you are not here to perform. You are here to be felt, to be met, to be understood, not explained. So if you're in a space where your pain is always inconvenient, where your joy is never echoed, where your heart is always negotiating how much of itself it's allowed to show, pause. You are not difficult. You are not too much. You are someone who has been unseen for too long. And the people who truly care will not ask you to shrink. They will not require silence to stay close. They will walk with you, not around you, because that's what empathy is. It's not dramatic. It's not grand. It's presence. It's quiet understanding. It's someone choosing to be with you in your truth, even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy, you deserve that. Not just in theory, but in practice. Not just someday, but now. There's a moment that breaks something inside you, not because it's loud, but because it's familiar. You've heard the apology before. You've heard it a dozen times, maybe 100. You know the rhythm of it. The soft voice, the lowered eyes, the I didn't mean to, the I'll do better. And for a second, something in you relaxes, hopes, believes. And then it happens again. This is the trap of repeated betrayal wrapped in apology. Carl Jung taught that repeated behavior is never accidental. It is a sign that the psyche has not yet evolved past a certain pattern. And when someone keeps hurting you in the same way, what you're witnessing is not their struggle, it's their choice. Whether conscious or not, it's a cycle they've committed to. And every apology becomes part of the performance. Not an act of change, but an act of delay. You begin to feel like a witness in your own relationship. You start measuring love in promises instead of presence, in intentions instead of actions. You convince yourself that the effort counts for something, that trying is enough. But trying without transformation is just a loop. It keeps you tethered to the hope that someday, they'll finally mean it. But someday doesn't come, because they don't have to change. Not when the apology is enough to reset everything. Not when you keep forgiving without seeing the repair. Not when your boundaries blur the moment their voice softens. And this is where the pain compounds, not just from what they do, but from what you allow. You start to doubt your own strength. You start to wonder if maybe this is just what love looks like. Maybe everyone hurts each other. Maybe forgiveness means forgetting. Maybe loyalty means staying, even when your soul is slowly going silent. But you know better. You feel it in the pit of your stomach when you hear the same apology for the 5th time. You feel it when you flinch, not from the hurt itself, but from the moment you realize nothing will change. You feel it when you start rehearsing your response before the wound even happens, because you know it's coming. You always do. This is the erosion of self-trust, and it is one of the quietest forms of self-abandonment. You start confusing endurance with love, thinking that the longer you last, the deeper the bond. But love isn't proven through pain tolerance. Love is proven through change, through growth, through the willingness to stop doing the thing that breaks the person you claim to love. An apology, when real, is sacred. It's the moment the soul takes responsibility. It's the moment the shadow is seen and integrated. But when it's used as a tool to escape accountability, it becomes manipulation. It becomes a reset button that protects them from guilt while leaving you to carry the wound. Jung would remind us that the psyche always seeks wholeness, but some people aren't ready for it. Some people prefer the familiarity of dysfunction to the discomfort of transformation. And if you stay in that pattern, you become part of it. Not because you're broken, but because you've been conditioned to see love as repair instead of recognition. You deserve more than repair. You deserve someone who doesn't keep breaking you. You deserve someone who learns from the pain they cause and chooses differently. Not once, not twice, but always. Because consistency is the foundation of trust, and without it, every apology is just another crack in the structure. Another promise that won't hold. Another echo that fades as soon as the moment calms. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to demand perfection from others. But you do need to protect the part of you that keeps hoping while silently breaking. You do need to say this isn't working, even if they beg you to stay. You do need to walk away from the cycle, not because you're heartless, but because you've remembered how much your heart matters. This is not bitterness. This is clarity. This is you choosing to stop playing a role in a drama that never changes. This is you saying, I want love that doesn't need to apologize for existing. And if they call you cold, if they call you selfish, if they say you've changed, let them. Because you have. You've woken up. You've seen the pattern for what it is. You've realized that love without accountability is not love. It's theater. And your life is not a stage for someone else's performance. You are allowed to want peace that isn't earned through pain. You are allowed to end the loop, even if you still love them. You are allowed to choose yourself, not as a rejection of them, but as a return to your own soul. Because in the end, every repeated betrayal is not just a statement about them. It's a question to you. Are you ready to break the pattern? Are you ready to become the person who says no, not because you've stopped loving, but because you've started remembering who you are? The answer doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be true. You've heard it said before. They're just independent. They're not really the emotional type. They need space. And maybe you believed it. Maybe you admired their autonomy, the way they moved through life with so little need for reassurance. It looked like strength. It looked like confidence. It looked like self-sufficiency. But over time, something felt off. Because every time you reached out, they stayed distant. Every time you opened up, they closed. Every moment that asked for vulnerability was met with avoidance. And slowly you began to feel alone, inside a relationship. This is the hidden wound of selfishness disguised as independence. Carl Jung warned that unchecked individuality can become a mask for emotional detachment. It is not wrong to need space. It is not wrong to be self-sufficient. But when someone consistently prioritizes their solitude over the connection, when they use their autonomy as an excuse not to show up, what they're really doing is protecting themselves at your expense. You begin to notice the imbalance. You're always the one initiating, always the one checking in, always the one trying to bridge the emotional distance. And at first you tell yourself it's just their style, their attachment type, their personality. But eventually, it stops feeling like love and starts feeling like labor. Because you are carrying the weight of the relationship on your back and calling it devotion. But love is not one-sided effort. And when one person does all the emotional reaching, it's no longer connection, it's performance. You become the caretaker of the bond, the one keeping the wires plugged in while the other floats just out of reach. And the worst part? They'll praise your loyalty. They'll admire your warmth. They'll say, you're so understanding, without ever wondering what it costs you, because they've mistaken your generosity for unshakable strength. They've assumed you don't need reciprocity, only presence. And presence without emotional engagement is emptiness. Jung would call this a dysfunctional energy exchange, one where the emotional current only flows one way, where one partner gives, adapts, adjusts, and the other remains unaffected, untouched, secure in their detachment. And that imbalance isn't sustainable. It drains you. You begin to feel ashamed for needing more. You start rehearsing how to bring it up, gently, carefully, so you don't scare them away. You begin to question if you're needy, too emotional, too soft, too much. But the truth is, you're not too much. They're giving too little. And autonomy, when used to avoid emotional intimacy, becomes a form of abandonment. Not dramatic, not obvious, but slow, invisible. You feel it in their silence, in their absence when you need to be held, in their unwillingness to show up for the hard conversations. It's the kind of absence that pretends to be presence. And that kind of absence changes you. You begin to lower your expectations. You stop sharing your inner world because there's no one listening. You stop asking for more because you've been taught that asking equals pressure. And eventually, you stop recognizing the version of yourself that believed love should feel like mutual effort. But it should. Because real independence doesn't dodge responsibility. It shares it. Real independence doesn't avoid emotion. It honors it. It says, I can take care of myself and still choose to care for you. So when someone uses independence as an emotional shield, they're not showing strength. They're showing fear. Fear of closeness. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of being needed in a way they haven't yet learned how to answer. And that fear isn't your job to fix. It's your job to recognize. Because no matter how understanding you are, you cannot build intimacy by yourself. You cannot make up for someone else's absence with more effort. You cannot keep giving from a well that's never replenished. Jung believed that wholeness comes from balance, from the integration of opposites, and a relationship without reciprocity is an imbalance waiting to collapse. Not from drama, but from depletion. You deserve someone who reaches too. Someone who asks, "How are you?" and waits for the real answer. Someone who shares their inner life without being forced. Someone who understands that emotional availability is not weakness, it's maturity. So if you're always the one filling the silence, always the one holding space, always the one doing the emotional labor, pause. And ask yourself, who would I be if I stopped? Would they come closer? Or would the relationship vanish into the space I was holding alone? Because love that depends entirely on your giving isn't love, it's convenience. And you were not born to be convenient. You were born to be met, fully, willingly, repeatedly. So the next time someone calls their distance independence, ask what they're really protecting. And then ask yourself, do I want to be someone's emotional shelter or someone's emotional partner? Because one leaves you empty, and the other makes you whole. At first it makes you laugh, not because it's funny, but because you're trying to be easy. You're trying not to take it personally. You're trying to go along with the joke, even when the joke lands in your chest like a rock. They make a comment in front of friends, a little jab, a story twisted just enough to make you the punchline. Everyone chuckles, you smile too, but something inside you doesn't. Because you know this isn't playfulness, this is sarcasm as a weapon. Carl Jung warned that what is not brought to consciousness will be lived as fate. And sarcasm, when used repeatedly, is often the unconscious leaking out. The resentment that hasn't been named, the hostility that isn't safe enough to speak directly. So it finds another way, through jokes, through mocking, through humor that draws blood. And when it happens often enough, it stops being humor. It becomes conditioning. You learn to accept disrespect as entertainment. You learn to stay silent rather than be called too sensitive. You learn to second-guess your instincts. Was that really cruel, or am I just overreacting? You tell yourself you're imagining things, that it's just their way, that they don't mean it, but you feel it. In the sting behind the laugh, in the pause before you speak, wondering if your words will be twisted into irony. In the way your body tenses around their voice, anticipating another disguised blow. Sarcasm, when used this way, is not harmless. It is passive aggression in costume. It is a form of emotional distancing, one that allows the speaker to express their shadow while avoiding accountability. It's a hit and run, a way to say what they really think and then blame you for the injury. I was just kidding. You're too sensitive. Can't you take a joke? But you're not too sensitive. You're intuitive. You're perceptive. You know when words are meant to connect and when they're meant to cut. And sarcasm used like this always cuts, even when it wears a smile. Jung would call this a projection of the unowned shadow. When someone cannot face their own anger, their own envy, their own insecurity, they disown it, they push it out. And often it shows up in humor, in the need to control the emotional tone of the room, in the compulsion to laugh at what should be felt, in the inability to sit with vulnerability. So they deflect, they jab, they make everything funny because the truth is too heavy to hold. But you are not a canvas for someone else's unprocessed emotion. You are not here to be the target of someone's indirect rage. You are not required to find pain funny just to stay close. Because what starts as a joke quickly becomes a pattern. A pattern where your dignity erodes, one punchline at a time. A pattern where your emotional safety is traded for someone else's comfort. A pattern where every moment of connection becomes a minefield. Will they turn this into a joke too? And when they do, they expect you to laugh. Because laughter is their cover. Laughter is their shield. But behind the laughter, something colder grows. Distance, contempt, control. You start minimizing your truth. You stop sharing your joy, your mess, your pain, because everything you offer becomes raw material for their performance. And what's left is a version of you that is always edited, always on edge, always defending yourself before anyone else can attack. But you don't have to live like that. You don't have to be someone's emotional prop. You don't have to stay in relationships where being heard always comes with being hurt. Real closeness doesn't need sarcasm to feel safe. It doesn't need to mock to feel powerful. It doesn't require you to bleed for someone else's amusement. Real closeness listens. It respects. It knows the difference between laughter and harm. And if someone consistently chooses sarcasm over sincerity, that's not personality. That's avoidance. That's emotional immaturity. That's a sign that they haven't learned how to hold another human being without armoring up in irony. You can want playfulness. You can want laughter, but not at the expense of dignity. Not at the cost of your self-worth. So pay attention to how they joke. Pay attention to what they laugh at. Pay attention to whether your spirit feels brighter or dimmer after being with them. Because if you are constantly managing your reactions to avoid being made fun of, you're not in relationship, you're in defense. Jung would say the first step to healing is naming what is happening. So name it. That wasn't a joke. That wasn't harmless. That was a boundary being tested. And you're allowed to say no. Even with a smile on your face. Even in a room full of laughter. Even when they say, you're ruining the mood. Because your safety matters more than someone else's performance. Your truth matters more than their punchline. And love never sounds like mockery. It doesn't slam the door. It doesn't shout. It doesn't erupt like the arguments you've come to expect from movies or memories. No, this pain comes wrapped in stillness, in silence, in the space between messages, in the eyes that no longer meet yours. It's not conflict, it's absence, and it stings in a way that noise never could. This is emotional withdrawal used as punishment. Carl Jung described such behaviors as regressions into shadow, a retreat into unconscious patterns when facing vulnerability becomes too overwhelming. Instead of speaking, they vanish. Instead of addressing, they disappear. Instead of expressing hurt, they punish with silence. And silence, when used like this, is not peace, it's exile. You feel it when something small goes wrong, a disagreement, a difference in perspective, a moment where you stood in your truth, and suddenly, they're not there, no response, no warmth, just cold space, calculated distance. You check your phone, you replay what you said, you wonder what triggered the freeze. And in that wondering, something dangerous begins. You start blaming yourself. Because that's what emotional withdrawal does. It teaches you to see your needs as disruptive. It makes you question whether you're worth staying close to. It creates the illusion that love is conditional. And the condition is your silence, your compliance, your ability to never rock the boat. But relationships are not built in silence. They are built in presence. When someone withholds affection or communication as a way to gain control, they are not expressing emotion, they are avoiding it. And their avoidance becomes your burden. You begin to chase. You apologize for things you didn't do. You walk on eggshells. You offer comfort to someone who has created distance to manipulate your behavior. You start to believe that closeness must be earned. Jung would call this a power game driven by unconscious fear. The person withdrawing doesn't feel safe with confrontation. They feel safe with control, and silence becomes their weapon. It gives them time, power, a sense of superiority. But it leaves you confused, insecure, constantly trying to restore something that never should have been broken in the first place. Because love, real love, does not disappear when challenged. It does not withhold affection to prove a point. It does not turn cold to maintain the upper hand. It moves toward, not away. It asks what went wrong. It listens. It stays. But emotional withdrawal says nothing. It lets the air grow heavier. It turns your longing into shame. It convinces you that your emotional needs are too demanding, that your desire for connection is unreasonable. And over time you shrink. You stop bringing things up. You keep your disappointments quiet. You swallow your truth because the cost of speaking it feels too high. And what started as a loving bond becomes a silent transaction. I will not upset you if you promise not to leave. But that's not intimacy, that's captivity. You deserve more than someone who punishes you with their absence. You deserve someone who shows up, even when it's hard. You deserve someone who says, I'm hurt, not someone who makes you guess what you did wrong. Someone who responds, not someone who retreats. someone who doesn't use silence as a tool to erase your worth. Jung taught that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. And for so many, this cycle of silent punishment feels like fate, like something that just keeps happening, like something we must endure. But it's not fate, it's a pattern. And patterns can be broken. You are allowed to ask for communication. You are allowed to say, I don't feel safe when you disappear. You are allowed to leave a dynamic where your voice has to fight for air. Because love without communication is not love, it's control. And silence, when used as a form of power, is emotional abandonment. So if someone disappears when you need them most, don't chase, don't plead, don't shrink yourself to fit the silence they've built. Stand in your truth. Speak even if the room is empty, because your words matter, even if they never respond. Because your heart deserves presence, even if they can't give it. Because the love you're learning to hold for yourself must never be withdrawn, not even when others vanish. And when they do, let them. Let their absence become the space where your clarity grows. Let the silence they leave behind become the soil where your voice begins again. Let this be the moment you stop calling it love when someone makes you feel invisible. Because you are not invisible. You are not too much. You are not wrong for wanting to be met with words, with warmth, with the kind of attention that doesn't vanish the moment things get hard. You are here to be seen, to be felt, to be heard, especially in your most human moments. And anyone who turns their back on that, no matter how quietly, is not loving you. They're managing you. You can walk away from that now. And in the leaving, you will return to yourself. Let it soften now. Let the ache settle. Let the questions grow quiet as the weight begins to lift. You've carried too much for too long. You've made excuses for pain that had no business staying. You've learned to call dysfunction love, but tonight, something in you is waking up. Slowly. Gently. Like light returning to a dim room. You don't have to figure everything out right now. You don't have to have the perfect words or the cleanest exit. You only have to listen to your body, to your breath, to the soft truth rising inside you that says, I deserve better. I deserve peace. I deserve to be met with eyes that don't flinch at my fullness. Let that be enough for now. Let yourself drift into the stillness, knowing that clarity is beginning, that the world you're building inside will no longer tolerate what wounds it. That love, when it finally finds you whole, will feel different. Quiet, safe, true. Rest, you've already begun.